What if I told you one of the most famous men in human history might never have existed at all? Moses, the man who split the Red Sea, who spoke with God face to face, who marched an entire nation out of slavery. He's celebrated in churches, synagogues, and mosques. His laws are carved into courthouses. His story has shaped civilization for thousands of years. But here's the problem. When historians and archaeologists go looking for him, they find nothing. No footprints in the desert, no Egyptian record of plagues or mass escapes. No mention of this supposed nation of slaves that embarrassed the most powerful empire on earth. It's silence, a silence so loud, it shakes the foundations of everything we've been told. And that's where the mystery begins. Because the question isn't just, did Moses exist? The real question is, who created him, and why? Was he a real man, erased from history by chance? Or was he something else entirely, a carefully crafted myth, designed not to record history, but to control it? Stay with me, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. The missing evidence, the borrowed myths, the hidden authors, and the shocking reason the story was stitched together in the first place. By the end of this, you'll see Moses not as a single man, but as one of humanity's greatest storytelling inventions, a character written and rewritten for power, identity, and survival. And once you understand how his story was built, you'll never look at it the same way again. Moses, the man who vanishes in history. So let's draw a line here. On one side, we've got Moses the legend, the liberator of slaves, the prophet who saw God's face, the lawgiver who came down a mountain with stone tablets that still echo in every sermon today. That's the Moses we grew up with. But what happens when you go looking for Moses, the historical man? You'd expect mountains of evidence, right? Egypt was the most documented civilization of the ancient world. They recorded every battle, every famine, even their pharaoh's bad dreams. Yet, not a single line about millions of Hebrew slaves escaping, plagues devastating the land, or an army swallowed by the sea. Nothing. And archaeology? Same story. If millions of people wandered the desert for 40 years, we should find ruins, graves, campsites, something. Instead, scholars dig and dig, and the desert gives back only silence. That silence forces us to ask, if the history books are empty, where did Moses actually come from? And this is where things get fascinating, because when you strip away the miracles and the legends, what you find isn't history at all. You find a character shaped and reshaped by storytellers. A figure who grows more powerful, more divine, the further away he gets from the time he supposedly lived. This isn't unusual in the ancient world. It's what happens when a community needs a myth more than a biography. Heroes are invented, pasts are polished, and stories are written to answer the problems of the present. So if Moses wasn't a man leaving footprints in Egyptian sand, he was something even more influential. A story leaving footprints across human history. And that leads us straight into the next problem, the Exodus, the Great Escape, the centerpiece of the Moses tale. If that never happened, what does it say about everything else? Egypt, Exodus, and the missing evidence. The Exodus. It's the blockbuster moment. Moses versus Pharaoh. 10 plagues. The Red Sea splitting wide open. Millions of people walking free. It's the kind of story you'd expect to dominate Egyptian records, right? The humiliation of Pharaoh, the death of the firstborn, an entire slave class vanishing overnight. That would be the biggest crisis Egypt ever faced. And yet, nothing. Not a single temple inscription. No papyrus scrolls. No battle reports. Egypt bragged about victories and even carved their defeats into stone. But this, the greatest embarrassment in their history? The record is blank. And it's not just the Egyptians. Archaeologists have combed the Sinai Desert for decades. If millions of people camped there for 40 years, we should find traces, pottery shards, tools, graves, fire pits, something. Instead, silence. A silence so complete it shouts louder than any evidence could. And here's the kicker. The timeline doesn't even fit. The pharaohs often linked to the Exodus, like Ramses II, left behind walls of detailed records about their reigns. None of them mention plagues, or floods, or losing an army in the sea. Instead, they describe thriving empires, trade networks, and military campaigns. The world of the Bible's Exodus just doesn't match the Egypt we actually know. So what does that mean? Does it prove the whole thing was made up? Not exactly. Stories often start with a grain of truth. Maybe a small group of people fled Egypt. Maybe a memory of oppression got magnified over generations. But by the time it was written down, it wasn't history anymore. It was myth. And that myth worked. It wasn't about recording what happened. It was about teaching who they were. The Exodus story became the ultimate tale of chosen people, divine justice, and liberation. But if the event itself collapses under scrutiny, we're left with an even bigger question. Who wrote this story in the first place? And what did they stand to gain? The borrowed myths. Here's the part nobody in Sunday school ever told you. The story of Moses wasn't unique. In fact, huge chunks of it were borrowed, recycled from older myths that were already circulating in the ancient world. Let's start with the famous basket scene. Baby Moses floating down the Nile, rescued and raised in Pharaoh's palace. Sounds dramatic, right? Except the same story shows up centuries earlier in Mesopotamia. The legend of Sargon of Akkad describes how he was placed in a basket, floated down a river, and discovered by royalty. Moses didn't invent the trope, he inherited it. And the laws? We're told they came straight from God, carved in stone, untouchable and eternal. But if you line them up next to the Code of Hammurabi, written hundreds of years earlier, the similarities are uncanny. An eye for an eye, property laws, marriage rules, justice framed as divine decree. Moses' tablets look less like brand new revelations and more like an edited remix of older law codes. Even the miracles aren't unique. Rivers turning to blood, staffs turning into serpents, seas parting. These were motifs floating around Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions long before the Hebrews wrote them down. They were symbols, powerful images audiences already understood. The biblical writers didn't create them from scratch. They rebranded them. And here's the key point. None of this was accidental. By stitching together elements from older legends, the authors gave their people an instant sense of legitimacy. These weren't just tribal stories anymore. They tapped into imagery recognized across the ancient world. It was a way of saying, our God is older, stronger, and our story is just as epic as yours. So when people imagine Moses as a once-in-history miracle worker, the uncomfortable truth is this: his story was built out of borrowed pieces. A patchwork myth, carefully stitched from scraps of older civilizations. And that brings us to the real question. If Moses' story was constructed, who were the ones doing the stitching? The hidden authors. Here's the twist that flips everything upside down. Moses didn't write Moses. In fact, he was written into existence. For centuries, tradition claimed Moses himself wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. But modern scholarship pulled back the curtain, and what it found wasn't a single divine author, it was a chorus of human voices. This is called the documentary hypothesis. Instead of one hand chiseling history into stone, there were at least 4. The Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly writers, each with their own agenda, each with their own style. And when you read closely, you can still hear them fighting with each other inside the text. The Yahwist writes about a God who's personal, almost human. He walks in gardens, changes his mind, argues with people face to face. The Elohist, totally different tone. His God is distant, formal, speaking in dreams and visions. Then the Deuteronomist shows up centuries later, obsessed with law, obedience, and national identity. His Moses doesn't just lead, he warns, he curses, he explains every disaster as punishment for breaking the covenant. And finally, the priestly writer, meticulous, obsessed with rituals, sacrifices, genealogies. His version of Moses is less prophet and more religious administrator. Here's the kicker. These voices don't line up neatly. Sometimes they contradict each other outright. Sometimes the same story is told twice, with different details. Sometimes they even use different names for God in the same passage. What does that tell us? That Moses wasn't a historical figure leaving behind personal memoirs. He was a composite character, stitched together by editors who needed him to be bigger than life. The miracle isn't that one man could do all these things. The miracle is how communities across centuries collaborated to create him. And once you see the fingerprints of multiple authors, the question shifts. If Moses wasn't a man holding a pen, but a myth on a page, then why did these authors invent him in the first place? Propaganda in the wilderness. So let's ask the big question: why invent Moses in the first place? The answer isn't just religion, it's politics. Pure and simple. Picture a fractured people, scattered tribes, no central government, surrounded by empires that could swallow them whole. How do you turn wandering clans into a single nation? You give them a unifying story. You give them a leader so larger than life that his authority can never be challenged. You give them Moses. And here's the genius move. Don't frame the laws as human ideas. Frame them as commands from God himself. That way, they're not up for debate. They're not negotiable. They're eternal. Break them, and you're not just disobeying a leader, you're rebelling against the divine. The same trick works for land. If tribes fight over territory, that's politics. But if the land is promised by God, suddenly conquest isn't theft. It's destiny. Suddenly war isn't aggression. It's obedience. And Moses ties it all together. He doesn't just deliver laws. He doesn't just lead migrations. He becomes the perfect mouthpiece. Every command carries divine weight. Every battle becomes holy. Every piece of land is claimed by right of prophecy. Think about that for a second. Moses didn't just solve a leadership problem, he solved a legitimacy problem. With him, tribal laws became sacred commandments. Local land grabs became divine inheritance. And scattered tribes became God's chosen people. That's why Moses was the perfect political invention. And here's the kicker. This wasn't a one-time use. His image kept evolving. Every new generation reshaped him to meet their struggles. But the core idea stayed the same. Moses was a tool, a myth designed to bind people together under divine authority. So if Moses was propaganda, then we need to ask, where did the writers even get the building blocks for his myth? Control through law and fear. Now let's get real about the so-called laws of Moses. We've been told they're universal ethics, timeless truths that apply to everyone, everywhere. But when you actually read them, they're not universal at all. They're tribal codes, written for a specific people in a specific time. Take the 10 Commandments. Sounds noble, right? But look closer. They're not about global morality. They're about loyalty. Loyalty to one God, one tribe, one authority. No other gods before me. Honor your parents. Keep the Sabbath. These aren't universal values. They're boundary lines, marking who's in and who's out. And it gets darker. Purity laws, food bans, rules about what women can or can't do with their bodies. These weren't about health or holiness. They were about control. Control through shame. Control through fear. If you eat the wrong food, you're unclean. If you touch the wrong person, you're unclean. If you're a woman on your period, you're unclean. Suddenly, everyday life becomes a minefield. And who has the power to decide what's clean and what's not? The priests, the same people writing the rules. Here's the genius and the danger. By stamping "God told Moses" on every law, you shut down debate before it even starts. These aren't just rules, they're commandments. Disobey them, and you're not just breaking social norms, you're breaking divine will. That's a fear you can't argue with. So what we end up with isn't morality handed down from heaven. It's obedience enforced on earth. And the system worked. People internalized it, passed it down, and still call it sacred law thousands of years later. But here's where it gets interesting. Moses doesn't stay frozen as just a lawgiver. His image evolves. In fact, every new generation reshaped him for their own purposes. And that evolution reveals something even more shocking about how myths survive. Moses evolves over time. Here's the thing about myths. They don't sit still, they evolve. And Moses, he's one of the best examples in all of history. At first, he's a tribal lawgiver, a figure designed to pull scattered clans together, hand them rules, and keep them in line. But over time, he grows. He becomes more than a leader. He becomes a national hero, the man who stood up to Pharaoh, who carried an entire people out of slavery. Then, as centuries pass and the community changes, so does Moses. In exile, when everything is falling apart, he shifts again into the prophet who warns, who curses, who explains suffering as punishment for breaking the covenant. That version of Moses kept people clinging to their identity when their world was collapsing. But it doesn't stop there. When Christianity emerges, Moses gets reinvented again. This time he's not just a prophet, he's the prototype. The lawgiver that Jesus is framed as fulfilling or even surpassing. Moses becomes the foil, the setup for the Christian savior. And then Islam arrives. In the Quran, Moses is everywhere. He's not a side character. He's the most mentioned prophet. His story gets reshaped once again to fit a new narrative of guidance and submission to God. See the pattern? Each generation took Moses and molded him to match their struggles. Lawgiver, hero, prophet, symbol. His story never stayed fixed because it was never really about one man. It was about identity, authority, survival. That's why Moses is still alive in the cultural imagination today, not because he was real, but because he was useful. Contradictions that reveal the truth. Now here's where the illusion cracks. If Moses was one man writing his own story, you'd expect consistency. A single voice. A single version. But when you actually read the texts, what you find are contradictions, and they're everywhere. Take this. Sometimes Moses speaks face to face with God, like an old friend. Other times, he can't even get close. The message comes through an angel, or a dream, or a burning bush. Which one is it? Did he walk and talk with God, or not? Or, look at his personality. In some passages, Moses is painfully humble, begging God to choose someone else. In others, he's commanding and unstoppable, performing miracles with total authority. Those aren't just mood swings. They're clashing portraits from different storytellers. Even the same stories repeat, with different details. Water comes from a rock, twice. The 10 Commandments are given, smashed, then given again. Sometimes the laws don't even match. Scholars call these doublets, but really, they're fingerprints. The seams of the patchwork still show. And then you've got the different names for God. Yahweh here, Elohim there. It's not sloppy editing. It's evidence that two traditions got spliced together. Each author had their own way of telling the tale, and instead of picking one, later editors just glued them both in. So, what does that tell us? That Moses wasn't a single historical figure writing memoirs. He was a character constructed by multiple voices, each with their own agenda. Think of it like this. The Bible is less a diary and more a collage. The contradictions aren't mistakes, they're clues. They reveal the hidden hands behind the curtain, the blueprint of authority. So why does the Moses myth work so well? Because it isn't just a story, it's a blueprint, a formula for authority that still gets used today. Here's how it works. Step 1. Create a charismatic leader. Someone who stands above the crowd, chosen by destiny, set apart. That's Moses. The shepherd who becomes prophet, the outsider who speaks for God. Step 2. Give him divine law, not suggestions, not advice. Commandments. Rules carved in stone, untouchable because they come from beyond human hands. If the law comes straight from God, who dares argue with it? Step 3. Lock it into a sacred text, a written record that survives the leader, that can be read, recited, and enforced for generations. Moses may die on the mountain, but the story of Moses never does. His authority becomes eternal because it's embedded in words. That combination, leader, law, and text, is political dynamite. It doesn't just create a movement, it creates a system that outlives the original storytellers. And here's the kicker. It's not just religion that copies this formula. Secular revolutions use the same trick. America has its founding fathers, its constitution, and its declaration that some truths are self-evident. France had Robespierre and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Modern states still use symbols, documents, and larger-than-life figures to claim authority that feels untouchable. In other words, Moses isn't just a biblical character. He's the template, the model for how power gets legitimized. And once you see that, you realize his story was never about a single man wandering the desert. It was about creating a system that could hold people together and keep them in line. But here's the part they didn't want you to notice. When you peel away the miracles and the myths, the fingerprints of power are everywhere. what they didn't want you to know. Here's the part that flips the whole story upside down. Moses was never really about one man at all. He was about power. Think about it. The laws? They weren't brand new revelations. They were adapted from older codes. The miracles? Recycled myths from Egypt and Mesopotamia. The contradictions? Traces of different authors stitched together over centuries. And yet, the story was sold as a perfect whole. Why? Because once you wrap human inventions in divine packaging, they become untouchable. Say, God told Moses, and suddenly no one can question it. This is what they didn't want you to know. Moses wasn't history. He was strategy, a carefully constructed myth designed to unify people, justify conquest, and lock obedience into place. Every piece of the narrative serves a purpose. Exodus wasn't about a historical escape. It was about giving a scattered people an identity. The Promised Land wasn't about geography. It was about entitlement. The commandments weren't universal truths. They were tribal rules dressed up as eternal law. And the beauty of the system is how well it hides itself. If you're raised with the story, you don't question the seams. You don't notice the contradictions. You don't ask why Egypt never wrote down the plagues, or why Hammurabi's code looks like an early draft of the Ten Commandments. You just accept. That's the brilliance of myth-making. It's not designed to be historically accurate. It's designed to feel inevitable. But once you see it, once you recognize that Moses was a literary construction, not a historical leader, you can't go back. You start spotting the fingerprints of human authors everywhere. And suddenly, the Bible reads less like divine revelation and more like propaganda with very human fingerprints all over it. And that leads us to the bigger picture. If even Moses, the central prophet, the lawgiver, is a myth stitched together for power, what does that say about the rest of the eternal truths we've been taught? Breaking the spell. So, let's step back. What have we really uncovered here? Moses, the lawgiver, the prophet, the liberator, wasn't one man writing history. He was a story. A myth built from recycled legends, stitched together by multiple authors, edited and re-edited across centuries. The Exodus? No evidence. The laws? Echoes of older codes. The miracles? Borrowed symbols. The contradictions? Fingerprints of too many hands at work. And yet, the story worked. It bound tribes into nations. It justified conquest. It created obedience where none existed before. Moses wasn't just a character. He was the perfect invention. But here's the deeper truth. Once you realize that, you start to see the pattern everywhere. In religion, in politics, in culture. Founders elevated into larger-than-life figures. Rules dressed up as divine or self-evident. Texts turned into sacred, untouchable authority. This isn't just about Moses. It's about the blueprint of control, one we're still living under today. And here's the real challenge. Are we brave enough to see through it? To recognize myth for what it is? To separate genuine morality, empathy, compassion, reason from stories engineered to control us? Because once you see the stitches, the spell is broken. You can never read the story the same way again. If you've made it this far, you already know. History is stranger and far more human than we were taught. And if you want to keep peeling back the layers, if you want more deep dives into the hidden side of religion, then hit subscribe. Because this is just one story. And trust me, there are many more.